Good evening, everyone. My name is Lucy Sandell, and I work at the Career Development Team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled Mapping Your Own Career and Navigating the Transitions. The recording will be shared with all registrants within the next few days. So whether you registered for this evening or for tomorrow, you'll all get it. I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter, Roxanne Alvarez. Roxanne graduated in 2000 from the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration with a master's degree. Roxanne was a bit of a rebel as a girl. She dropped out of 5th grade when she was living in Mexico. Thankfully, she decided to return to school, and in high school, she went a trip to London and flew on the Concorde. Now, I'm old enough to remember the Concorde, and if you remember it, it flew from JFK and Dulles to London and Paris in half the time of the other jets. So pretty cool. Roxanne is a drummer and will acquire another set as soon as she moves into a more soundproof environment. Before we start, before I hand over the controls, let's do a quick poll. Okay. So this is you answering one of these questions. I have made a career transition, contemplated a career transition, not considered a career transition before now. Go ahead and answer, and we'll close it up in a couple of seconds. Okay, so half of you have made a career transition and half of you have contemplated a career transition. That's pretty good. I'm glad to hear it. Let's do poll number 2. Whoops. Whoops, the daisy. I'm not mastering my poll today. Sorry about that. Well, maybe we can return to the poll. I'm just going to close it for now. Roxanne, it's my pleasure, and I'm handing over the controls to you.
Thanks so much, Lucy. I appreciate it, and the very interesting intro, a bit of my background there. So welcome everyone who's on the webinar tonight. I really appreciate the flexibility in joining us live. I think we'll have a good discussion together, and those who aren't on will get to hear the recording tomorrow. So as Lucy mentioned, my name is Roxanne Alvarez. I live in Seattle, moving out here just in January, and you know, actually the reason we're having this sort of second special session, or the having it the day before, is that I'm actually going through a career transition myself actually this week, starting a new position, which I'll talk a little bit about shortly. So I do appreciate the accommodation to be able to kind of change the time, but I look forward to getting your questions and hearing more from you as well as we go along. So just to start very briefly about myself, hopefully some of you have read the bio that was up online, but just very briefly, I have a master's in economics from George Mason, as well as my master's in social work from USC, and I got a bachelor's in psychology at AU, American University in Washington. I've lived in different cities in the country, as well as traveled a bunch, and you can see I've lived in Miami, Chicago, and DC, and then made the and I have close to 20 years of diverse experience. I've worked in all kinds of nonprofit settings. All my career has been in the nonprofit sector for the most part, working in direct social services as well as grant making and program management and development. And so now I'm a senior program officer with the Biller Family Foundation based here in Seattle. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that we do. And like I said, this is my third day on the job, so I certainly have a lot more to learn. So in my new role, here's the Sheri and Les Biller Family Foundation, a little bit about us here on this particular slide. We have the vision and the mission. And basically, we're a grant-making family foundation. We do grant making in 4 main areas, which I listed here around education programs, supportive and social services, what we call social impact theater, which are cultural events that tie to very high impact and social issues that need to be discussed in the community. And so we do an educational cultural piece to that. And we also fund programs in what we call career pathways, which is really job training services and programming that we help develop with nonprofit partners to implement in the field. And 2 examples of the programs, which will be programs I'll lead in the future, are called BankWorks and CareerWorks. And each one are job training programs that work with young people who may not necessarily want to go to college or have the opportunity to necessarily go to university, but who want to have interesting and fulfilling careers. And BankWorks, it would be for the financial services industry, and CareerWorks, our first program for that will be in the healthcare industry. So working on that this summer, actually, and hoping to launch that in September. And BankWorks has been in operation for over 10 years with a lot of success in Los Angeles as well as in the Seattle area. Our grant making is primarily LA and Seattle, though we are branching out and funding programs in Alaska and Oregon now as well. And our website's there if you'd like to please take a look and learn more about us. So diving into career transitions, and I'm really excited to talk about this. I've talked about, for better or worse, my career transitions a great deal, and so it's exciting always to hear from others about their path, but whatever position I've been in, and we'll talk about the different positions I've been in a moment, but I tend to get this question a lot, and so I don't know how many of you get this question. It might be obvious if you've studied, say, chemistry and you become a chemist, right? So I think people can kind of get why you went into that line of work. But for the kind of work I've done, particularly in the nonprofit sector, you're often wearing many hats and you're doing many different kinds of functions in an organization. And it's not always obvious based on what your degree was, how you got into it. So this question here comes up a lot for me. How do you get into this line of work? How did you come upon this position? And so the reason I get the question a lot, I think, is that sometimes, again, it's not always a clear path from the degree that I earned and then the positions that I've held. And then I've also kind of made positions for myself, if you will, or tried to carve out a career that's allowed me to pursue all these different interests that I have. And they don't all fit into a nice, neat industry or category. So as I point out here, I'm always seeking positions that kind of balance out my idealism and my pragmatism. I'm always looking for things where I can apply, rational thought and theory on some level, but then also I'm always trying to figure out how can we improve the state of the world. So in that spirit, I think right after U of C, I actually did direct social service work, and I was working at a domestic violence shelter and had done some of my internship was at a rape crisis center in Chicago. And I didn't initially think I would do that right out of school. I thought I was going to become a policy, program development kind of person, but I really saw an opportunity as well as a need for me to get kind of involved in the field, very hands-on immediately. So that was my first job out of grad school, and I learned a great deal about many things in that position. And so that sort of paved the way for some other work that I didn't expect I would do, which then led me to grants development. And again, people wonder, well, how did you pivot to do that? And I think it was my interest in grants because of the program that I was working in out of at the domestic violence shelter. We had a grant that got cut. We no longer had funding in the program in a way, including my position, unfortunately, at the time. So I became very curious about the process of grants and grant making. And I fortunately found a position, someone who was willing to take a chance on me regardless of the fact that I didn't have direct grants experience at the time, and really mentored me in a lot of ways. So I continued my path in my career in grants development, and that was pretty much for several years before then I decided to move back to DC because I after U of C went down to Florida to live in Miami. But then I went back to DC, and like most people in DC, you get mixed up in the policy world, and so I did that for a little while with a community organizing group. But I found it wasn't really for me, and so I went back into universities and grants administration in DC, and I did that for several more years. But then, as tends to happen to me, once I feel I sort of reached a certain level of mastery in something, not that there's not always something to learn, but you also have to always feel engaged and excited, I think, about your work. I started to ponder different things, different paths. And so I took some time off and I traveled, which I've done several times actually as well in my life. And after that, I decided to get another master's degree. And I had an opportunity to go back to school. And I went back to study economics. And in doing that, I sort of combined those degrees and my interests and focused on international development. I got very interested in microfinance while I was in school and economic empowerment and entrepreneurial work. And this was around the time of the latest economic troubles that we had in the U.S. So labor market was really tough at the time I finished my second master's. And so I had to get creative like most people do when you just have to do that. So I decided to try to become a consultant. So I had a solo practice and I had a few clients, I'm happy to say. And I called myself microfinancier. I was focused on microfinance and social programming, social businesses. And I did that for about a year and a half. Very hard to have your own business. Those who've done it successfully, I admire very much. You certainly need a good amount of capital to get going, but also you have to be quite tenacious, I think, and you have to be prepared to really go down with the ship if necessary. And so that was something I learned a lot in that position that I created for myself in that opportunity. But that said, I saw an opportunity at the United Nations Foundation at the time I was doing my social practice, or rather my solo practice. So I went back to doing grants, but from a philanthropy standpoint. So grant making versus grant seeking or fundraising. And I really enjoyed that very much, and we worked all over the world. We certainly worked with the UN most closely, supported the UN programs. And I was there for about 3.5 years or so. And once again, kind of decided, well, I'll try something else out. Something I'll get into a little bit later. I created an initiative at the UN Foundation that kind of woke up some other part of me that made me realize I really enjoyed program development as well, and kind of doing other work besides grants and kind of business operations. And I was doing more of that at UNF. And so then I took a position at Action International, which is a microfinance and impact investing firm. But I was there in the capacity of doing training and capacity building for the staff there, focused on microfinance. But then, decided to make another change, and this time it was a fairly big change because I decided to move, along with my partner, to the West and to really go to the Pacific Northwest and kind of try out a different way of life. And fortunately, we made the opportunity to chance, and so I knew that the next position, I thought, well, one of the things I would like to get back to is doing philanthropic grant making. That was something that I really enjoyed when I was at UN Foundation, really understanding the programs and the people doing great social service work in the community. So that was my goal when we came back, and so I'm extraordinarily happy and grateful that I've managed to find a position to do that again. So maybe before I get into risk-taking, Lucy, I think we might have one other poll. Is that right?
Yep.
We can try
they're behaving themselves this time.
Okay.
Thank you for sticking with me. So the quick poll is, if you've not made a career transition, what's holding you back? Why not? You're satisfied with your career, you're not totally satisfied, but you don't know what move to make, and you're dissatisfied, but you're cautious about leaving. Okay, just give it a couple more seconds. Come on, I know there's some of you who haven't voted yet. Okay, we're going to close the poll. And okay. So no one said that they're satisfied with their career. Well,
Oh,
maybe that's
no.
a good reason that they're on this call. And I guess this gives you something to talk about.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first, I'm sorry to hear that. I think I certainly had times in my career where it certainly feels a lot easier and safer to stay where you are than to venture into an unknown, and particularly if labor market is very shaky, it's a big risk, and given individual responsibilities and family commitments and whatnot, it's not easy to make any changes. So I'll say that first. But that said, you know, we spend a lot of time in our work lives, and we spend a lot of time at our jobs and with our colleagues. And so I would encourage people on the call to think through a little bit more about why maybe you know, their risk tolerance is particularly low, or why they haven't made a change when they've really felt they wanted to. And like I said, understanding responsibility, sometimes you just have to do what you feel you have to do. But if you have a chance, it seems wise to maybe think through a way to make a change that you'll be happier and more fulfilled. So these are just ideas and suggestions of the way I've sort of carried myself in my career, and ideas that I'm happy to share with others. And so when I think about making changes, like most people, maybe it's more the folks who study economics or something like that, you sort of go through a risk analysis of what it would mean to make the change. And so I kind of list these three on the slide here, three aspects of risk taking that I think are important. It's one, to know what your tolerance is, first of all, like how much risk are you willing to take? If you haven't made many changes in your life, you probably haven't tested this out very much, but it's really important, I think, to assess how much you're willing to risk. So that could be a cut in pay, certainly, so we can think of the most basic, you know, the monetary aspects. Maybe having a lapse in your career for a little while because you're looking for something else. So maybe, depending on your situation, you are taking time off to think about that. Maybe it's going back to school, which means you're going to be out of the labor market for a little while and could be harder to get back in. As I mentioned in my narrative earlier, when I finished my second master's, certainly didn't expect the economy to go the way it did, and so it was a really tough transition after school at that point. So I'd say number one, always try to take a pulse and figure out what your tolerance is. The second point I'll make is around timing. So sometimes a natural opportunity will kind of come up for you. So I mentioned earning a new degree. When you finish school, that's a great time to kind of start fresh, or start in a new field, or start in a different direction than where you were going before. This has happened to me a few times when they restructure at your organization, and I'm sure I would be surprised if anyone on the call hasn't experienced something like this. But it's also a great opportunity to maybe switch gears within the organization, certainly, so maybe moving into a different department, different function, probably depending on the direction of the organization, might be a natural time for you to leave that organization and move into something else, or go with another group. So I think that that's a time that sometimes allows you to kind of think about taking the chance to make a change. And as I mentioned, labor market changes. So I, you know, started my consulting practice mainly out of necessity, to be honest. On some level, it was, well, the kinds of jobs that I want aren't readily available. And there are certain jobs I'm not willing to do again, given where I'm at in my studies or my career. And so you kind of have to carve that out for yourself. And so that's what I did with microfinance here. I said, well, not exactly what I want is not out there, so let me try to make exactly what I want happen. So, you know, I would suggest that labor market changes, a sort of shift in how people are hiring, what industries are becoming very popular. All of that can provide opportunity. And then the last thing is the testing out. It's just like, it's sort of a cycle. I think you go through analyzing what your tolerance is, you try to seek opportunity to make the change, and then test it out. Figure out what happens if I make this change. How stressful is that for you? How difficult is it for you in a lot of ways, whether it be financial or otherwise? And so I think of risk-taking as sort of these three aspects, and something to keep in mind as you're thinking about changes. So just a word on marketing and networking, because I think it is such a critical aspect of making any kind of change or transition to your working life. Because sometimes you may not have the reputation that you had in a former position or in a former field. So for example, I mentioned that I started off with social science background, psychology, then went into social work. And so then when I wanted to get jobs, say, that were more around economics or economic development, going back to like, how did you get into this line of work? You know, you have to be able to market yourself as someone who can get into the new field. So it's really important to kind of build that brand for yourself. And we'll talk a little bit about ways to do that here, but I can't stress enough the importance of kind of coming out of your shell if you're not a naturally extroverted person, to really build that case for yourself, kind of have pitches ready. You know, what's your 3-minute pitch in the elevator with someone when you want to convince them that while you studied or worked in a field for 10 years, you're ready to do this other thing. I think it's really important that you communicate that well. The second bullet point here is around what I call humble leadership. And what I mean by that is it's sort of that balance of, you know, bragging, certainly, marketing yourself, being able to put out there what it is you can offer an organization or an employer, but then also recognize that you know, you're willing to learn more, and you might not necessarily get your dream job as you pivot into a new area. And so it's important to be willing to change and learn, but then also be able to show off what it is that you have to offer. The word on networking is just that do it as often as you can and go to a broad array of networking events. So not just ones where you know, like, oh, I know the organizations that'll be there, or it's something I'm familiar with, like go out of your comfort zone. And I think of this when I think of U of C in particular, because when I was doing microfinance here for myself, I started going to the business school alumni events, even though I wasn't an alum from Booth. And that was really out of my comfort zone in a lot of ways, but it really was important for me to be able to talk the language of the business people and to learn and kind of be able to network in that community. And so I actually managed to get a client out of one of the times that I did that. So, you know, challenge yourself and be willing to kind of go beyond your comfort zone. It is really important. Simple ways, certainly joining membership groups, kind of expanding your reach, volunteering, just meeting a lot of people. You just never know where opportunities arise, and I've learned this many times, you know, thinking like, oh, I'm not going to meet someone that's, you know, going to have a job per se, but you never know who knows someone else. And it took me a long time, frankly, to appreciate, I guess, the importance of networking, or to kind of feel comfortable with the concept, because I often felt like, oh, it feels kind of inorganic or disingenuous to kind of go to these events and try to introduce yourself in what felt like schmoozing, for lack of a better word. But in fact, you know, there are many ways you can do it, and you don't have to lose your identity in networking well. And I found that that was the best way that I could learn about organizations. It's how I learned about the UN Foundation when I was doing my solo work. Just talking to people and getting to know as many people as you can. For sort of less extroverted method would be sort of enhancing your social media presence, so doing things online. I started a blog at the time I did microfinance here. I got really into Twitter. I'm still on Twitter now, but I was really using it in lots of creative ways, not just to talk about the work that I was doing, but also to see what others were doing and who could I connect or contact to collaborate with potentially, or to learn about what they do. So getting, you know, much more involved in social media, which is now kind of old hat, I realize. It's not like a new idea, but I think that there are still people I meet at various stages in their career who don't seem to see the value in having some kind of online presence. And so I just want to emphasize that that's something to consider, another way to kind of market yourself. I mentioned volunteering, just another way to kind of get in touch with other groups and get to meet as many people as you can. So I want to make sure to talk a little bit about mentoring, because it's a subject I care very much about. And I've had great experience with having a great mentor, or two actually, in my career. Even though it wasn't a formal mentoring relationship, but they were people I learned a lot from, and that really changed, I think, the course of my career in a lot of ways. So I just want to offer some suggestions on mentoring, because I think that sometimes people think it has to be something very formal, like you go out and find a mentor and they take you to lunch every week and they impart great knowledge and you'll become successful. But In fact, it's a lot more, there's a lot more nuance to it, and I think there are a lot of ways that you can find the right person for you and be the right person for that mentor, which I'll talk about what I mean there. But so when you think about mentors, I like to push people to think beyond the people they already work with. So not necessarily your supervisor. For obvious reasons, this might not be the best person to be a mentor for you. And some people find it a little strange that the person that kind of manages their time, the sort of, you know, evaluating them would also be a mentor. They might not feel they're getting the most, I guess, you know, the kind of guidance that would be impartial. But I did fortunately have one mentor that was my supervisor, and she was fantastic. And to this day, I'm in touch with her and bounce ideas off of her. And that really just happened just by chance, and I'm very grateful. But it doesn't always work out like that, that the person you work for is someone you particularly admire in terms of professional development. You can certainly respect them and you work with them, but they're not someone you necessarily think, oh, I want to learn exactly how they do things. And so a thing I'll keep in mind is great mentors allow you to shine, they encourage your growth, and they're willing to share their social capital. So like the networks and the people that they know. Those who are not great mentors obviously are people who might be working out of fear and might be working to hold you back actually. And you may already know how to tell when that's happening. And so all I do is emphasize, don't let it happen. Don't let someone discourage you or try to control sort of any of your career simply because they might be in a position of power in a current job. Think beyond the job. Think of finding people and networking with others who are outside of your day-to-day. So on that note, that's where I go. Take charge of your professional development. It is your development. It's not on someone else's responsibility to make you a better anything. And so in that spirit, that means going back to what I said, analyzing your risk, looking at ways to market yourself and improve yourself, and really owning that and kind of figuring out how to get to where you want to be in your career. So in that spirit, I want to share a little bit about what I did at the UN Foundation. I alluded to it earlier. I created an initiative there, just seeing that there was a need for it, frankly, amongst the staff, that we had a great HR team, but as most HR departments are, particularly in nonprofits, they're fairly small staff and they're not always thinking about professional development amongst all the other things they're working on. So I actually got the support of HR at the UN Foundation to go ahead with my idea, which I called MOVES, which stands, as you see here, Mutually Beneficial Organic Voluntary Exchange for Staff. And it was a quasi-mentoring program. Basically, we wanted to do something that was less formal, but allowed for staff to come together to learn from each other. My idea was that everyone had something to teach and to learn from each other at any level. So we had people who were vice presidents and more senior staff involved in our initiative, as well as the more junior staff that were just starting out. And it was a really great opportunity to kind of get back into developing a program from scratch and hearing from the staff about what they wanted to do. We did working group kind of skill building meetings, as well as brown bag lunches. We had speakers. We practiced networking, actually. We had an event where we brought everyone together to practice introducing themselves, how to do that. And it sounds rudimentary to some folks who might be in the field a long time or who naturally have the ability to be very charming, perhaps. But you'd be surprised. A lot of folks really hate meeting people they don't know, or really hate talking to people they don't know, I should say. So I think trying to get over that a little bit in a professional setting that was a fun way, was a way amongst other colleagues to safely kind of experiment. I think I was very happy and pleased to hear good feedback about MOVES and sort of the impact that it was having on the staff. And when I left UN Foundation, my understanding was they were trying to keep the initiative going. There was a lot of interest to keep it going. So I hope it continues to do well there. So my last point on mentoring is something that I've read a little bit about, some literature out there in business leadership around this, but I really think it's not so much about finding a mentor, but it's really about being found by the right person. So the way I see it is, as I mentioned before, you should take charge of your professional development. You need to really build into your career plan for yourself how you want to get to your goals, how you want to meet the goals, where you want to be, whether it be the 3, 5-year, 10-year goal plan, however suits you. I think in that, you invest in yourself, whether that be go back to school, do the marketing, networking that I mentioned, kind of build a network for yourself. And I think you start to build your brand, your reputation, and people take notice. And so I think you need to be someone that's worth mentoring, which sometimes I think I've heard people think it sounds a little harsh. But I do think that particularly if you're looking to have someone who's very successful be your mentor, their time is incredibly limited, you can imagine. Well, all of our time is very valuable, of course. And so you don't want to waste that time. You want to be someone that they feel it's worth their time to spend with you to impart their knowledge, as well as to help you build the skills that you need to get to where you want to go. So I really emphasize it's not about finding a mentor, which often people will say, how do I find a good mentor? There are a lot of books on this, I think, but ultimately I think it's about being found by someone, being someone that someone else wants to mentor. I just want to emphasize that. And my last point on mentoring is simply this. I mean, you can become richer by paying it forward, and this is something I believe really strongly in. I volunteered myself for a variety of mentoring programs. I continue to do it now. Whether it be formally through a program or through the alumni community like the one we have at UFC, there's so many ways that you can give back to another person, another generation. Or it could be, a peer mentor. It could be someone of sort of the same level in their career as you are, but you can learn from each other. So there are many ways, I think, to promote mentoring, to benefit from it. And I do believe that it's worthwhile in creating a professional community. So note on confidence, because I think that career transitions are sort of navigating the unexpected, or however you want to think about it. All of that on some level requires a level of confidence, and that doesn't mean that someone is completely fine with, they have no insecurities, or they're completely, brave in everything they do. I think confidence, like most things, needs to be practiced. And so these are just some ideas I have around that and suggestions in terms of the more risks you take, I think you increase your confidence level with those, even for those that don't work out, I think, and maybe even more so. Certainly a positive attitude fosters more motivation, and in doing that, I think you often feel better about yourself, that you're being productive, you're trying to get something done, you have a goal. Resilience is often, comes out of things that didn't work out, and you have to bounce back from them, and I think that failure sort of strengthens our confidence muscles in a lot of ways, and I'll talk about failure, but I think that it's important to not rule out the possibility of something not working out, because you can learn a lot from it, as everyone says, but also each time something doesn't work out, I think kind of builds up your muscles for the next thing that could work out. I mentioned about mentoring, teaching, reinforcing skills. It's really important. The more you talk about professional development for yourself or trying to help someone else, I think just sort of reinforces all of that for you. And so it really is a win-win as you mentor somebody else. And I just pose this as, food for thought, or you can, write in the chat box if you like. But at least from my experience, the times that I felt the most confident, and it's not all the time every day, but whenever I have felt most confident, it's usually been after I've overcome something that's been particularly difficult, or where I've failed many times at trying to get something, and it's finally worked because maybe I changed my approach or a tactic. So I just pose that to all of you in terms of when have you felt most confident, and maybe that might help you decide about when is a good time to make a career transition or make a change. Was it after you were feeling immediately you got something right and you were successful, or was it more likely after something that you realized took some work to achieve? I would love to hear from those of you, because that's something I often ponder, is it worth having another failure? Will I feel better or worse about myself if I try something and it doesn't work out? But for myself, it's often been the challenge that pushed me forward. So here is the slide on failure. And maybe the title seems a little off-putting, but I do think that in pursuing, rather, maybe not to say failure, but rather pursuing the possibility of failure is ultimately to find success, I think. I think failure is a byproduct of us staying curious and being open to learning, which means we don't master everything all the time. Even those at University of Chicago have failed in something. And I think it's important to have that experience. I think that's when we really learn about ourselves and what we're good at, what we're not, but also what we're willing to do to work harder and maybe get to something that's not easy at first. I say here confidence and entrepreneurial alertness. When you basically pay attention to possibilities and opportunities and face them with confidence, then the idea of failing seems much less scary, I think. And I think your willingness to then pursue something that's a big risk it just doesn't seem as daunting. Being resilient and resourceful, I think often tests are tested rather during these times of failure. I think we really then start to learn what we can bounce back from and where we can learn to improve ourselves and how do we do that, whether it be through networking, as I mentioned, whether it be getting a mentor to spend time with us. Maybe it's starting, like I mentioned, moves. In many ways, I started moves kind of for myself, frankly. I was trying to seek out other colleagues at the organization that I could learn from as well. And so I think sometimes you just have to be pushed a little bit for those things to emerge. And I'll leave you with the idea that I think that no matter what change you might pursue or how long it might take you to get to somewhere, as long as you're working on projects and with organizations that are really aligned with how you think and your values, I think you always feel successful. I mean, it might take a while to get to that point, or it may not be an immediate success. But I think ultimately evaluating things rather than on some other metrics that might be how long you've been in the field, certainly how much money are you making, what is your title, where is your office in an organization, things like that. Really looking at things that are a little bit more nuanced than that in terms of how are you spending all the days that you're working, which, like I said, we spend a lot of time in our work lives. What is the legacy of that time? Because the time you're spending there is time away from your family and friends and other things you value. So you really hope that you're investing that in a way that you can feel proud about what you're doing. So this is my contact info. Kind of went through things to make sure we left time for questions. I'm so happy to hear how many of you are actually live in this session, and I want to make sure to get to questions you might have. But I'm happy to continue the conversation, whether now or offline. You can also reach me through email and on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with you. But I really enjoyed this opportunity to just talk a little bit about my ideas on career transitions. And like I said, especially during this week when I'm contemplating all these things in real time, I appreciate sharing it with you. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we have a few questions, and please don't feel shy. Go ahead and type more questions in the box. Roxanne, would you mind sharing what would you say is a common thread, even though you've made quite a few changes in your career? What would be a common thread that you see throughout it?
So I think for myself, given that I've dedicated my career to nonprofit work, I have to feel really connected to the mission of the organization I work in or the projects I take on. So like when I was doing consulting work, you know, what are the contracts that I'm taking on? What is the goal of the project? What are we trying to do? So I have to feel connected to the mission. There's certain areas, social issues that are of particular issues for me or concerns for me that I really want to try to tackle, and so I try to pursue projects in those areas. I think it sounds maybe trite, but it has to be something I believe in. I think there are many things I know that I either have tried or wouldn't consider trying because it just didn't feel like it would suit my personality, or because of the values I have around certain things, I just know I couldn't do it. And so I think that kind of authenticity has to be there, and that's something you obviously can't manufacture. So it's like either I feel like I'm connected or I'm not.
Great, thanks for that answer. I've got another question here by somebody who's dialed in. What is a good way to build an online presence on social media like LinkedIn or Twitter for someone who's beginning or in the process of a career transition?
Sure. So the way I've approached it, and certainly there are many ideas around this, but I mean, LinkedIn is free to use starting off. So you can get subscriptions and get more involved with it, and a lot of recruiters do use it for that. But I mean, you just create a profile. And then it's about, if you're not a natural writer or someone who feels they communicate well in writing, work with someone that you know who craft the messages that you want to convey. So it's important in terms of describing what it is you've done and being really illustrative and giving really concrete examples of the kind of work you've done so people get a picture of who you are. So that's LinkedIn, and maybe even a blog or something, though I don't know how many people still do blogging, but I still have my blog, but I haven't blogged in a while, I hate to say, but I think it's an important place to go to kind of have, kind of take stock and be able to write your ideas and kind of project them. So those are easy things that anyone can do, I think, just kind of start online. Twitter, similarly, set up your account, think of a handle that you want. I did it based on what was happening with my consulting work at the time, and so that's why I have microfinance here, and I've stuck with that. But just start putting your ideas out there. I've provided a little training sometimes on this when I've worked in different places, when I'm working with colleagues who've never really used social media. And by the way, this could be across generations. I think often there's this idea that certain groups of people are masters and others are completely Luddites, and it's not true. I learned the most I've ever learned about social media from someone a generation ahead of me. So that's just to say, I think you just start out, test it out, create your identity, start following people you're interested in. I used Twitter exclusively when I got it going for professional reasons. Now I've branched out and do some other kinds of tweets that focus on culture or music or what's happening in my current moment. But craft how you want to be seen, really. I mean, you're creating your image, and so follow the people that interest you, engage with them. Start small. Don't feel like you have to be, have 10,000 followers on day one. Just start, a little bit at a time, getting your message out there, interacting with people, and you'd be surprised. You start getting followers and start having sort of a natural rhythm with it.
Great. I get a lot of questions when I do these webinars about education and how your education links to the work that you're doing. Have you found that you've got 2 master's degrees, you're obviously very well educated. Have you found that you've learned a lot more on the job because you had that education, you made those transitions, and now you've become an expert, really?
Well, I mean, I'm a big proponent of education for lots of reasons. I think, you build up skills and push yourself to think, and depending on the kind of degree or where you go, I suppose you learn a lot from those around you. So could you do that on a job? In other words, if I'm understanding, it's like having the education pushing you to do more in the job rather than just learning on the job. Is that what you mean? Or because I think that for myself, they go hand in hand, but I certainly don't think I could have gotten as far in some of the things I've done without having some formal education. There are things I think you can learn, some trades and skills that you can learn on the job, but I think there's some things that help you kind of create a network. And so like alumni, for example, I've utilized our alumni network, not just at U of C, but some of my other schools, to learn from others and kind of seek out other opportunities. And that might be hard to do if you kind of stay and learn only on, kind of look at one job as your learning stage.
Great, thank you. Another question was, the person starts off with thanking you for the great presentation, which I agree. This person has worked independently for a while and is looking to transition back into the workforce. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah. So this is what happened to me, like I said, after my second master's, and I started doing my own thing, and I worked at it for about 1.5 years. So I mean, it certainly matters how long you're out of the labor market. Can feel more difficult as more time goes on, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're out of the running. And I do think that I just go back to some of the fundamental things I talked about, which is, pushing yourself to think outside of what you typically think would be an ideal job or organization. Maybe that means taking a step back a little bit in what you want to do. I've done that. Doesn't always feel good to do it, to feel like, okay, I'm maybe going a step backward to then go several leaps forward. Sometimes that's what's required, and depending on the market, it might be what your options are. So I would just say kind of expand your mind, expand your networks as much as possible. Tenacity, doesn't go out of style. Sometimes you just have to keep doing it. Every week, do as much as you can to get yourself and your resume out into the world. Utilize your networks. LinkedIn has been invaluable to me in this way. I know a lot of folks don't always use it or think much about it, but I've learned about a lot of opportunities, including the one that I'm in now, frankly, through LinkedIn. So, I think it's about, just tenacity, being, sticking with it and continuing to market yourself as best you can. It's definitely possible. It's hard some days, but it's definitely possible.
Great. Are there any other questions? You can just pile them up. I have a quick question. I know because I've read your blog, but there might be some people on the call or on the webinar who might not know what microfinance is. Would you mind sharing that?
Sure. So microfinance is a broader term. I think most people think of microfinance specifically as microcredit or small loans to start businesses. Started in other countries, but we have a form of microfinance certainly going on in the U.S. and more so since about 2008 or so. I think there's been a big spike in it. But it's essentially providing financial services and being financially inclusive of populations that might not otherwise have access to finance and banking. So microfinance in particular encompasses microloans, as I mentioned, micro savings, micro insurance, and this just means on a smaller scale, obviously. So someone who might want to start a business, depending on where they are, may need $1,000 to start that going versus what we might have in the U.S. So it's a form of financial services industry for the most economically vulnerable.
Great, thanks. That was a very clear explanation. I want to give people a last chance. I know the people on the East Coast, it's fairly late for you, so I appreciate you joining us. Let's give another minute. Hey, you know what we could do? The last poll. Everybody feel like doing a poll? Well, you can't really say no, so I will launch it. Do you work in the same field that you studied at University of Chicago? Definitely yes. Well, you could argue that it's close to the same field. No, but I did work in my field before changing careers. No, and I've never worked in the field I studied. I can't even remember what I studied, so that's a no.
I'm intrigued by that answer.
Well, I wanted to give 5.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I got my bachelor's and I had my psychology degree, initially, I thought I was going to maybe go on and get a PhD in psychology, and I would do research and teach and sort of do a more traditional psychology path. And then, some different experiences happened. At some point, I realized, I'm much more interested in something a little more hands-on than research. Not that research can't be hands-on. You can do field research, and a lot of qualitative work is really great. But I started to realize I was more interested in having a practical side to the work around social service. And that's how I got into social work. So, I mean, there are many ways that we start thinking about how our career is going to go, and then due to our own experiences or other exposure to other people or anything, we kind of switch gears. So I actually haven't met that many people, frankly, who have stayed in the same career for decades or who studied something through undergraduate and graduate school and went on to stay in that. So I find those to be the rare birds, but maybe it depends on who you're hanging out with. I'm not sure.
Yeah, let's see. Share that poll. Oh, 50% of you stayed or currently working in the same field, great. You could argue it's close to the same field. No, but they did work. So their education did pay off. If people want to just type in the question box what they're doing, who are answered the definitely yes, I'm curious to know. Somebody else asked a question. What is the best career book you can recommend? This person had to join late.
Well, I'll be honest, I haven't really read that many career books. I tended to follow things like through Harvard Business Review, things online. I'm happy to, if you don't mind sending me an email, I have a list of resources that I often share with people when they ask sort of, where can I find some good advice on careers and business leadership in general, mentoring, things like that. So I've tended to get my information online through Twitter, actually, and then other websites. But I don't really have a book that I would say I'm particularly attached to or that I've read specifically on careers or, I mean, there's certainly lots of great books on workplace dynamics and sort of how to navigate the workplace. But in terms of careers, I haven't read anything specific that I could recommend.
Fair enough. Okay, so I think, well, we're at 7:51 Central Time. So I've just turned over to 7:52. So I don't want to keep people too late, but I do want to thank you, Roxanne. You gave a great presentation. I want everybody to know, oops, somebody typed in thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted everybody to know that I discovered Roxanne because she had attended another webinar. So if you have a burning desire to talk to me about a particular topic for a webinar, please let me know. This is Lucy Sandell, and you're going to be receiving an email from me likely tomorrow, so you can jump in and contact me. But I couldn't ask for a better presenter. Thank you so much, Roxanne. And I hope that you stay tuned. We're going to have more webinars in July and even in the dog days of August. So thank you all again for participating, and I look forward to having you sign up again in the future. Bye, y'all.
Thank you again.
Thank you.